Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm Ray McGovern. I used to be a CIA analyst for 27 years, and I'm delighted here to be able to moderate the Q&A and to introduce my good friend, Gilbert Doctorow. I should mention first that Gil writes in the first person singular, not the imperial we, as we have so much in Washington, but the singular I. And that's because Gil is a singular historian and political analyst with whom I've been delighted to be associated for a couple of years now, many years. We've talked together in Moscow and Brussels and independently elsewhere. And it's my pleasure to introduce him. But first, I have an announcement. You see in the newspapers today that Russia is playing a dirty game again. They did not react appropriately to being banned from the Winter Olympics. We have the Pravda here, the Washington Post here, reporting on this, that the punishment Russia is experienced is justified. Now, they say that in Russia there'll be howls of protest, that the West is mistreating Russia to gain some advantage in a new Cold War, but this would be wrong, end quote. Russian fans ought to be angry at their own government, their own leadership, for such reckless disregard for the integrity of international sports, says the Washington Post editorial today. Now, I don't want this to leave the room, but I'm reliably informed that this very adroit Russian non-reaction is the work of one Michael Flynn. My colleagues at NSA have told me that unmasked is a message from Flynn to the Russian ambassador just yesterday evening saying, don't overreact. So, clever? Oh, these Russians are insidious. And I just want to make sure that no one calls me a Putin puppet, like a 40-year friend of mine did publicly in thinking it possibly to denounce me twice, in an almost Stalinist way, pretending that he was a member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which he never was. And I just wonder what's next, a show trial for McGovern, like for Randy Credico, my friend in New York, the journalist who is being summoned to the House Intelligence Committee next week? I don't know. All I can say is that it's really refreshing to see so many people interested in the real scoop here. And I will not say any more because I want to leave as much time for Gil to speak, and then we'll have questions and answers. I hope that you can refrain from interrupting until Gil has finished his remarks, and then it will be a free for all. So thanks for coming. Thank you, Gil.
I'm very glad, in a way, that Ray has mentioned this Putin stooge or Putin puppet issue, and I imagine we can get to that in the Q&A. It's a question that I assumed would be raised if there were any unsympathetic or hostile attendees of this event. And you will be hearing in my address quite a bit about Russia, just as if you read my book, you'll see still more about Russia, often in very favorable light, in the sense that I'm describing and highlighting their achievements in the face of sanctions and other attempts to isolate and limit their role in the world. I make these remarks and comments not to praise, but to explain and to give the other side of the argument, which is by and large absent not only in the US media, but also in West European and world media. So we have an environment of burn before reading and of not listening to the other side, which can be fatal for reasons that I'll describe in my speech. At the very outset, I'd like to hand these around to those of you who have not perhaps read the comprehensive review of this book to which the event today is dedicated. That is a review that was published on November 19th on a news and commentary portal called the Duran, and which was republished the day after on November 20th by Johnson's Russia List. Johnson's Russia List may be an unknown digest to some of you in the audience. It is a daily, or 5 times a week, digest of newsworthy articles about Russia and the Ukraine that has been published for more than 20 years, initially with support from George Soros and other sponsors. Initially, not anymore. But with the aim of giving both sides to the argument and to bringing out diverse opinions on issues that are quite important for national security. This Johnson's Russia List has 6,000 subscribers, and it's virtually all the American universities and think tanks that have some interest in Russian affairs. So that was a kind of validation of the interview, and the interview itself, I think, is a very representative sampling of highlights from my book. So that is why this morning I will dispense with highlights. I'm going to give you a 30-minute address, which is focused on why the issues in the book should be of importance to you for your safety and for the safety of the world. And with that, let me begin this talk. Actually, I would call this, the speech that I'm about to give you, an additional chapter to the book, because the attempt I'm making this morning is to link the title question, why does the United States have a future, with the contents of the book. And as some people have observed, the book is mostly about Russia. So what is the relevance of the title? This book, which has, as you see, the 2 dust jackets of my latest book and the book of 2015, which bore the title, Does Russia Have a Future? I'm maintaining that these 2 questions are directly interlinked, and that the ongoing tug of war with Russia, which seemed to be so adversely stacked against Russia's survival when it broke out in its most severe form in 2014 with all of the actions taken to punish Russia for its alleged violation of the world order by taking possession of Crimea, that the economic and other personal sanctions seem to be threatening the Putin regime and the very viability of Russia as a player on the world stage. In the time since, Russia, by very, very capable economic and political management, has survived this stress test quite well, and as I will mention in a few minutes, by its various successes on the international arena, has put the United States in the position of question. We'll get to that. When I began preparation of this book 6 months ago, I never imagined that the title and the overriding concept would be so timely as it is today. Each new issue of the New York Times and the Washington Post provide additional material for the case. Each new revelation about groping or other sexual misconduct by U.S. congressmen reveals the nation's capital as a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah. But that is today. The evidence has been piling up for at least as far back as the essays in this new book were being written. In particular, the questioning of America's future has become a mainstream issue ever since the election of Donald Trump. The movement to obstruct and take down Trump began immediately. Open and public attacks, not just on his policies, but on his intellectual faculties and mental balance, have appeared in our mainstream press every day. A beleaguered president is lashing out in all directions. We see chaos in policy formation. Executive staff contradicts one another and contradicts the president himself on nearly daily basis. The president is flip-flopping on policy. He issues alarming tweets. Some well-considered observers have drawn dire conclusions from all of this. I think of David Rothkopf writing in Foreign Policy magazine on the 10th of May, 2017. The title of his article is "America, a Failing State." The author was for 5 years chief editor of what is a respected international relations journal. He believes that the United States is well on its way to becoming a banana republic. And for this he blames Trump and his cronies in high federal offices. They are a threat to national security, a disgrace on the world stage. The cronies are feathering their nests at the expense of the broad public. And the commander-in-chief shows open admiration for thugs and authoritarians abroad and disparages his federal employees, mocks the Constitution. However, the gloom over the future of the United States also appears in other, still more moderate and respected establishment publications. I take as my marker Foreign Affairs magazine, which has a subscription in the USA and abroad of several 100,000, and may be called the bedrock of the establishment. The essays there are issued in a neutral, scholarly tone rather than the deeply partisan attacks you'll find in the daily newspapers. Tellingly, the September-October 2014 issue of Foreign Affairs ran on its front cover the headline, "See America, Land of Decay and Dysfunction." That was the overarching title for a series of articles describing various aspects of failure in governance in the United States. More recently, in mid-August 2017, a Foreign Affairs article entitled "Kleptocracy in America" takes us entirely away from the personality peculiarities of the 45th president. And we go into the broader and more important realm of the systemic flaws of governance, namely the extraordinary political power wielded by the very wealthy due to the rules on election financing and the self-serving policies that they succeeded in enacting while the general public has stagnated economically for decades. All of this, of course, setting the stage for the voter revolt that brought Donald Trump to power. Then, as one final straw in the wind, I would mention the remarkable op-ed piece in the Washington Post on September 1st, 2017, written by Senator John McCain. He described American politics at the federal level as simply not working, and he blamed overheated partisanship that compromises the national interest. And it's a problem he knows very well since he himself has contributed heavily to it. He also named the never-ending electoral cycle. Indeed, a country which appears to be unable to govern itself is hardly the exemplar and all-powerful state suitable to govern the rest of the world. However persuasive these points of analysis may be, they overlook what I believe is a major determinant of the onset of America's decline as a world power that we are presently witnessing, and of its possible withdrawal into true isolationism. I take as the factor here the decision by Washington going back to 2007 to break the back of Russia. There are, just looking back over the last 20 years, there are several inflection points you can name where the United States was ratcheting up its efforts to contain or delimit Russia's ability to return as a major world power. But I take 2007 as the date that is most significant for what I'm going to say going in the rest of this essay, because it is when Vladimir Putin delivered his Munich Security Conference speech in February 2007, in which he laid out, speaking from the heart, and speaking, by the way, extemporaneously, which I know from the fact of grammatical mistakes in the text, which were never airbrushed out. And he set out all the grievances that Russia have had with the United States monopolar world going back to the end of the Cold War. You had John McCain, the U.S. Vice President, and other notables from the States and from other world powers, and 300 people attending that room who were shocked out of their skins. And within months, Washington, which was astonished at Putin's brazenness and his daring to speak from the heart in what are normally formal occasions, devoid of emotion, soon found its footing and began on the course that's led us to today in terms of deterioration, violent deterioration in relations with Russia. The U.S. has applied all imaginable efforts to put Russia in its place as Washington sees it, that place being just another regional power, a state that is in decline, a state that nods approvingly to whatever policy line comes out of Washington. These endeavors have mobilized American soft power and hard power. Soft power in attempts to foment a color revolution in Russia itself that removes Vladimir Putin from power by financing opposition figures, by imposing personal and economic sanctions in the hope of splitting the Kremlin elites, splitting them from one another and from their president and from the population, and a policy of denigrating the Russian president. What has been said about Putin publicly by American political leadership never would have been dared during the original Cold War. And I think, for example, of Hillary Clinton and her repeated description of Putin as a Hitler. It is unthinkable that anyone in the States in positions of political power would have described Leonid Brezhnev in anything approaching that type of insult. In parallel, there have been our attempts to contain Russia by a physical presence at its borders and off its shores through expansion of NATO going back to 1996, but in particular, the accession of several states in 2004. These were not the Eastern Europe, but they were already the former Soviet republics of the Baltics, which meant that the line of demarcation between Russia and NATO was right on Russia's borders. That has been compounded by our holding large-scale military exercises in these advanced positions within easy striking distance of St. Petersburg and other major Russian population centers. Then there has been the U.S. drive to achieve a first strike capability, namely development of weaponry and systems intended to decapitate Russia or any other enemy systems which are globally positioned and in space. Ray has reminded me to remind you of a book that has just come out by Daniel Ellsworth entitled The Doomsday Machine. Besides being the author of the Pentagon Papers and having known intimately all the details of our conduct of war in Vietnam, or misconduct of war, Ellsworth had in 1961 and before and after experience as a war planner for a nuclear war with Russia and China. And so what we're seeing now is not an invention of a U.S. policy to decapitate Russia, but its reestablishment as a U.S. policy with new technical feasibilities coming out of the latest technologies. The less dramatic technically, but from the Russian perspective equally threatening, has been the construction in Poland and in Romania of U.S. installations that are nominally designated as elements of a missile defense shield against Iran, but they can easily be modified, or easily the launchers that are in place in these bases can be used just as easily for offensive weapons, for offensive cruise missiles striking Russia as they can be for defensive anti-ballistic weapons. And this implementation of the missile defense shield intended for dual use against Russia has been put through over the loud, insistent and oft-repeated requests, finally demands by Russia, that we desist. And that failing that, they would take appropriate, what they called asymmetrical countermeasures. The end result of all these intertwined policies has been to create the very Frankenstein monster that we've talked about. I'm going to go a bit off script, not off the script that's in front of me, but off script in the sense of what those of us who are alarmed about the present state of confrontation with Russia want to say. It's very common, we say, that the Russians really are not such bad guys. In fact, we can be often faulted for portraying Russia as a kind of cuddly teddy bear. And here's where I'm going to head off in a different direction. The few politicians and Pentagon generals who have identified Russia as the single greatest threat to American security are entirely correct. Today, as in the past, during the original Cold War, Russia is the only country on Earth capable of reducing the entire continental United States to ashes within one day. But it also has capability that was not true during the original Cold War. It is the state most capable of deterring American military action against it by its advanced conventional warfare men and materiel. By this I mean precision bombs and cruise missiles launched from air and sea with global reach. And this is not widely known or perceived or talked about. Indeed, we were talking about this yesterday with Ray. I don't know how many of you are aware that the Russians have small frigates off the US coast, which are indistinguishable from other commercial vessels, and which are armed with cruise missiles. So the confrontation with Russia is no longer as it was in the 1960s, ICBMs with a 30-minute cycle. No, it's 2 or 3 minutes from a Russian vessel that's 20 miles off the shore from Washington, D.C. All right. This conventional capability was developed from virtually zero in the last 15 years and implemented throughout the Russian armed forces over the past 5 years. Their latest report, issued a month ago, is that they have 60% of Russian armed forces are equipped with the latest modern weapon systems, control and command systems, and the rest. And within the next 3 or 4 years, they'll have 100%. So this is not just for parades on Red Square. This is their fighting forces. This has been noted, and again, just at the outset when I was trying to establish that it's not marginals who are saying that America has a governance problem, but it's the establishment itself. The remarks that I just made to you, you can read in Foreign Affairs magazine this month. There's an article there by Ivo Daalder. Daalder I met in Brussels for 3-4 years. He was, I think it's about 2008, 2010. He was the US ambassador to NATO. He's a political scientist and academic. He's now the head of the Chicago Foreign Relations Council, the branch of that's otherwise here in Washington. Daalder makes precisely the point I just described about the new military capabilities of Russia. However, Daalder gives you the end result of Russia's modernization program and does not share with you the information essential to intelligence, to appreciate how this came about, why the Russians have done this, which is essential if you're going to deal with them. So that question of how this came about, you'll find in my books. The action, the reaction that's brought us to the present. Moreover, an article like Daalder's is not what the general public here is reading. Although Russia's threat to American well-being features daily on the front pages of newspapers of record and in the electronic media, this military threat is not what we read about or hear about. Instead, we are told about alleged Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections with the aim of discrediting Hillary Clinton and so promoting the electoral chances of Donald Trump. We're told about Russian attempts through social media, advertising, and otherwise to discredit the institutions of the American political system and to call into question the reliability of our voting procedures. This is fake news. Fake news that obscures the far more ominous problem of Russian military forces and the dangerous confrontations with Russia over the past year that were played down to the American public and European public by those very same Pentagon sources. The closest that our media has come to identifying a Russian military threat is talk of cyber warfare. Cyber warfare is only a small part of non-nuclear strategic and tactical means being deployed by Moscow. Now, let me be specific about how U.S. attempts to contain and control Russia over the past 25 years have backfired. Our first objective, to cripple the Russian economy by reducing its single biggest source of export revenues, gas and oil sales to Europe. You can trace the economic warfare back, as I did in my 2012 book entitled Stepping Out of Line, to the policies of the second Clinton administration that are widely called the pipeline wars or the new Great Game. Great Game was a name given to the Russian-British competition, imperial competition of the second half of the 19th century for control over Central Asia. And it's relevant here because both the pipelines and the sources of hydrocarbons that we're talking about are Central Asian. This entailed U.S. promotion of new energy suppliers to Europe, namely Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and finally, most recently, the USA itself, and its promotion of new paths to European markets, whether pipelines that bypass Russia or liquefied natural gas deliveries, as is the case today. The second dimension of this economic warfare has been sanctions, which the U.S. first imposed in 2012 under the guise of punishing Russian violations of human rights in the Magnitsky Act, and which were vastly expanded in 2014 up to the present to punish Russia for alleged violations of international law and of the post-Cold War order. These violations coming from its annexation or rejoining Crimea and the Russian Federation and its intervention in the Ukrainian civil war in Donbass, if not, most recently, by its military actions in Syria. Objective 2, isolate Russia and cast it as a pariah state, without friends or allies, expel Russia from major international gatherings like the G8, strip Russia of its veto in the United Nations Security Council, impugn its integrity, as in the case of the World Olympics movement. And we see the decision on the 5th to strip, 2 weeks ago, to strip Russia of 2 more of its gold medals from Sochi, and then the decision on the 5th to disallow the Russian participation in the forthcoming Korean Winter Olympics under the Russian state flag and the Russian state anthem, and to have them participate only as neutrals. Well, this is all part of the effort to cast aspersion on Russian honesty, integrity, and to place it as a pariah. It's a subset of the Isolate Russia campaign. And another subset is the ongoing effort to cut Russia off from access to military technology in a two-way sense. That is both denying Russia components or subsystems that would be important to its various defense developments, and to deny Russia sales of its own military hardware in the West. And the cancellation a week ago of Russian participation in Farnborough is just one more case in a long line of such actions. So what have we gotten for all of these efforts? First, the political effect of the economic warfare, especially of the sanctions, has been to rally the Russian population around its president and in defense of the nation. That is to say, it has been precisely the opposite of what the authors of these measures in US think tanks and in the State Department had projected. All of this has driven the approval ratings of Vladimir Putin from something like 65% 3 years ago to well over 80% for months on end this year. Secondly, these attacks have only strengthened the resilience and self-sufficiency of the Russian economy. The indiscriminate importation of all possible consumer and investment goods has stopped. Import substitution is the slogan of the day, and it is heartily supported by the general population. The slogan of Buy Russian has gained ground. And the countermeasures the Russians took by having an embargo on food and food imports from those countries that sanctioned it, and otherwise in support of domestic production through targeted programs of federal assistance, particularly credit assistance, to industries seen as especially prospective and important for the Russian civil economy. That has all taken root. The Russian producers, in the absence of competition from the West, have not sought monopoly margins. Instead, they have invested in diversified production and raised quality standards. The Russian products, which were widely seen as inferior by the Russian population before all these sanctions were put in place, is now appreciated to be competitive in price, in diversification, in quality, with what they previously had been importing. In particular, Russian agriculture has boomed. It's attracted large domestic investment. The result is that this year had the largest grain harvest. Russia had the largest grain harvest in 100 years and has substantially replaced European and US exporters in global markets. Russia also surpassed France this year as the largest exporter of beet sugar, of sugar beet sugar. I think if you're anyone with a memory of Russia's experiences in the 1970s, 80s, and even 90s, has to be impressed by this remarkable turnaround. Russia was once, before World War I, a major agricultural power, and it is again today. Thirdly, oh yes, I have to repeat a little-known fact. Russian agricultural exports this year are larger in dollar volume than Russian military exports. And it's not because the military exports have stagnated, quite the contrary. Speaking of something like $20 billion. Thirdly, the Russians came up with other pipelines and other partners to ensure their dominant position, a position as provider of imported gas to the EU. If there are any questions about this economic side of things, which has not received regular or substantial attention of US media, I'll be very happy to come back to it. The issue that is most relevant, I think, to any discussion in the States is does Russia have the potential to abuse its position as the major supplier, the single largest supplier of energy to Western Europe? And that is a subject that I hope there will be questions about, and I'm prepared to respond. So Russia has maintained and even slightly expanded its share of energy supplies to the EU. Russia continues to work on solutions that ensure that to the greatest extent possible, these supplies pass directly from its shores to EU consumers. Despite all the objections and all the difficulties raised by the United States, by Poland, by the Baltic states, Russia is pursuing its second line of Nord Stream, which goes, as you know, from the area around Viborg, northwestern Russia near St. Petersburg, straight to Germany without passing through any third states. So the Nord Stream 2 project is still being pursued, and it has replaced the frustrated South Stream project by what's called Turk Stream, which is beginning its implementation stage. Gas and oil production remain strong, and Russia has been developing its markets in Asia, first and foremost with China for pipeline-supplied gas and oil. Existing contracts call for supply to China of more than $300 billion in gas over 20 years via what's called the Power of Siberia pipeline that is now nearing completion. New markets are being opened in Eastern and Southeastern Asia for liquefied natural gas, which is being supplied from new Russian fields in the far north, namely Yamal, and from Eastern Siberia. The government's import substitution program in other economic sectors has been making remarkable strides. All of this takes time, of course. It doesn't happen overnight. And they are achieving what was long beyond reach in Russia, where other industrial sectors were not favored, given the high profitability and high volumes of hydrocarbon exports, the Dutch disease. Well, the Russians have gotten well beyond the Dutch disease now, and they have a newly revived pharmaceutical industry, for example, a newly revived civil aircraft industry. Now, second area is deterrence parity. The Russians have done exactly what Vladimir Putin said they would do. They have reacted in asymmetrical ways, finding defensive solutions that are entirely designed and produced at home, that are vastly less expensive to implement than the offensive systems developed by the United States, but which have all the necessary potency to neutralize American plans for a first-rate strike capability. That objective today, has been stymied on a Russian military budget that is 10 times less than the US spends, which consumes just 5% of the Russian GNP. For those who find the Russian military budget might be high as a percentage of GNP, let us remember that in Soviet times, the military consumed 25% of GNP. That was unbearable. 5% is wholly supportable by a motivated government that has behind it a patriotic-minded population, which is the case in Russia today. And again, let's put this number in a context, the $60 billion that Russia spends annually on its military. Let's remember that in 2014, the Russians put down $51 billion for infrastructure development in the Northern Caucasus in support of the 2014 Sochi Games. They've had very big projects, which they brought in on time and on budget, despite all of the remarks of Transparency International about corruption. They missed the point. Just again, an area that I'd be very happy to get into. What is corruption, and how was it originally defined by people who came out of the IMF and formed this Transparency International? It was about white elephant projects that never get completed. All of Russia's national projects get completed. We'll come back to that later. Geopolitics. The most stunning dimension of Russia's successful pushback to the US-led Western world has been geopolitical, entirely neutralizing efforts to isolate Russia. The historic geopolitical achievement of the Nixon-Kissinger period, namely bringing Washington closer to Beijing and to Moscow than either of them was to one another, that has all been undone. And again, as one of the articles in this collection speaks about Henry Kissinger and his most recent two books. One of them is World Order, and the one just preceding that was on China. And since Henry was the implementer, if not the original thinker, of the rapprochement with Beijing, you would expect that in his book on China, he would say a few words about how it's all coming unraveled under the last 3 U.S. Presidential administrations. Not a word. In fact, it's undone. Russia and China today are a de facto strategic alliance that is changing the geopolitical landscape of the globe and promises to change the economic power balance as well. Both countries are pursuing determinedly a policy of removing the dollar from its pedestal as the world's leading currency. Again, just a little aside, you will remember that the U.S. dollar's position as the world's number one, number two, number three reserve currency came about from the invention of the petrodollar in the 1970s. That all gas and oil trading worldwide is done in dollars. The Russians and the Chinese are putting in place trading in local currencies. In fact, as a result of that arrangement, Russia succeeded in sweeping past Saudi Arabia, which had been China's largest supplier of oil, to become just that, China's main supplier, as a result of trading in the yuan, as opposed to the dollar. The Chinese and Russians have put in place new global financial infrastructures to prevent the U.S. from imposing on them what it did to Iran. These institutions are parallel and alternative to the U.S.-controlled institutions dating back from just after World War II, like the IMF and the World Bank. Furthermore, Russia, like China, has been developing new sea and land lanes for global movements, that's hydrocarbons and other physical goods. These new lanes can replace and certainly reduce the importance of the U.S.-protected sea lanes through the Malacca Straits and the Suez Canal. In the case of China, this is the well-known New Silk Road or One Belt, One Road. In the case of Russia, its efforts are less well-known, but of substantial importance. That is the potentially game-changing northern sea route north of Siberia around to the east, coming down past Japan. That northern sea route is secured by the world's largest icebreaker fleet, much of it now nuclear-powered icebreaker fleet, which cuts through 1.5 meter ice flows and will, in its next generation coming out this year or next year, cut through 3 meter thick ice flows to free the passage year-round for global shipping. But it's not just the Northern Sea Route, it's also Russian plans to develop, to expand, and to speed up dramatically by putting in trains, freight and passenger trains capable of 400 kilometers an hour, 250 miles an hour, on the Siberian route, and still more important, within the Russian Far East. The latter plans include the building of a bridge from the continental Russia, its eastern frontiers, to Sakhalin Island, which is an island indeed, and that will be officially announced early in 2018. Now, why the date? Why? Well, it's very easy to understand. If you follow the Russian project with the Kerch bridge connecting the Russian mainland with Crimea, that will be completed within the next 6 to 9 months. And lo and behold, but the same construction team that was assembled and is very successfully and on time and on budget delivering one of the biggest engineering projects of our time, this Kerch Bridge, the Rothenberg's consortium will be in charge of building the bridge to Sakhalin. Why Sakhalin? Because the next bridge that follows on the Sakhalin bridge is a bridge to Japanese Hokkaido. This was in discussion at the Vladivostok Far Eastern Economic Forum that took place earlier this fall. The Russians believe in action first and words second, something which we have a hard time dealing with. Their action first is they have a significant and a mutually important economic relationship with a given country, and then they have a diplomatic entente. That's the case. That is the Russian and Japanese approach. That is Abe's approach also to solving the problem of the still unsettled state of war between Russia and Japan coming out of World War II. And you can be sure that this bridge, which will change the thinking of a generation, of Japanese and of the Russian Far East is a central issue in arriving at that peace treaty. That will make it possible for trains originating in Japan to cross to Europe with freight and passengers. And we're speaking now of cutting the transit time by using highly modern technology from a week to 1 or 2 days. So in speaking of the Russian-Chinese alliance, I fully acknowledge that this was not something arrived at naturally. The two countries have one of the longest common borders in the world, with a history of disputes going back to 1680s, Peter the Great, the Nerchinsk Treaty. So they've had a long time trying to delineate their border. We know that the Russians had more than 1 million, the Soviets had more than 1 million men in arms concentrated on their border with China in the period just before Mao Zedong did a deal with Nixon. So what has brought them together has been our blind policy of containing them both, worst of all, simultaneously. So we have driven them into one another's arms, and this is not something that can be reversed or changed by a come-hither look from Washington. The US-led effort to drive Russia from the Middle East by toppling the government of Bashar Assad in Syria, the one secular Arab state where the Russian Federation maintained a significant naval base that supports its presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, has been the bellwether in the US and United struggle with Russia to maintain global leadership. By all parameters, the US proxies in Syria have been defeated. The tide turned for the Assad regime when the Kremlin sent in its air force in September 2015. The game is almost up. The net result for Russia and the net loss for the United States is vastly greater than Syria itself. The war zone became testing grounds for Russia's latest precision weapon systems, for command and control, for space and drone reconnaissance. Russia demonstrated capabilities in conventional warfare that I should go over this slowly, that none of the NATO countries have, singly or collectively, without the United States. Russian self-confidence allowed them to feature their actions on television and in real time. All of this combined with their demonstrated diplomatic skills in working harmoniously with regional states that have difficult relations among themselves. For example, Turkey and Iran. By working in great secrecy, Russian overflights of Iraq, the Russian Joint Intelligence Sharing Center in Baghdad. These things were announced in September 2015 when Russia began its military campaign. They caught the United States completely off guard, despite our having several thousand intelligence agents operating on the ground. Again, for anybody with a long memory, Soviet Union was a country of loose lips. Mr. Putin's Russia is not. A couple of weeks ago, we received still more interesting news demonstrating Russia's upper hand in Syria and in the Middle East. I have in mind the meeting of the Russian president, Russian, Iranian, and Turkish presidents in Sochi to agree a common approach and procedures for political settlement in Syria that brings in all domestic parties to the conflict. You may object, well, what about Geneva? Geneva is a very nice decorative item, and the United States is present there, but nothing is happening in Geneva. That we are where we are today in Syria as a result of the deconfliction zones that were agreed by the conflicting parties in Kazakhstan, in Astana, over the last three to 5 months. The next round, which moves from military deconfliction to political settlement, will be held by a Congress to be convened including all political parties in in Russian Sochi, which is otherwise known as the Russian president's winter home. Just to give you a sense of the Russians' diplomatic skills, the Turks, the Iranians, and the Russians are co-guarantors of this meeting, of this Congress. The Turks, as you can imagine, did not want to have the Kurds present in this. They are going to be present. Not as Kurds, but as the people occupying this particular geography. So the parties found these ways to look at very tough issues because they have an immense common investment in finding solution to the single greatest source of terrorism in their region and in the world. This alliance between Russia, Turkey, and Iran is about as unnatural as things get. And they show it to be a major achievement of Russian diplomacy and political will, in which the United States is now just a bystander. When Donald Trump received a phone call 10 days ago, or just after this was announced, about the Congress in Sochi, he spoke with Vladimir Putin for an hour. That was not a consultation. That was a heads up. My point is that by pursuing its at times vicious campaign against Russia, the United States has been setting itself up for humiliation. Now, these are trend lines that preceded Donald Trump's accession to power. His personal contribution through his chaotic administration, inconsistent if not contradictory policy decisions from day to day, has been to further undermine faith among America's friends and fear among its detractors. His questioning of NATO has sent European politicians into a fit of confusion and despair. All of this gives greater impetus to the decline of U.S. standing, and it will be very hard for any future president to put this Humpty Dumpty back together again. However, all of the foregoing pales in significance compared to the ongoing risk of World War III and nuclear Armageddon from the present dismal state of U.S.-Russian relations. There is little communication. And this was terribly sad, but 2 days ago, Tillerson, who was in Brussels for a NATO gathering, came out with a still further continuation of the American policy of limiting to the greatest extent possible any contact with the Russians, a kind of cordon sanitaire. And this is from Tillerson. So you can't blame it on Nikki Haley. Well, this lack of communication in a period of great mutual distrust is a hazardous situation. And I can think of nothing approaching this since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I have little doubt that many of you here see these statements as over-dramatizing the risk of war. However, I wager that your feeling of security comes from simply not being informed. Regrettably, the information war that developed over the past several years has entailed news blackouts in Europe and in the United States regarding Russian-sourced news. We get plenty of news about Russia, but it's all generated here. What you will not hear is what they are saying. What our papers are telling us is what we think they should be thinking, not what they are thinking. And that is precisely why Putin is described as unpredictable, because we don't want to hear what he's saying. That's a problem that we created for ourselves. So I don't know how many of you were aware of how grave the situation became in September 2016 when US-led forces attacked the Syrian positions in the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor. Well, Deir ez-Zor back in 2016 didn't tell very much to people. It sounds rather exotic. It's been a lot in the news in the last few weeks. Deir ez-Zor is a territory near the Euphrates where Syrian forces were surrounded for more than a year by ISIL fighters. But the more relevant fact is it's the center of the Syrian oil fields. That is the source of the where's the money going to come from to rebuild Syria? It's there. So of course there's been hot fighting over it, and who will control it. Anyway, back in September 2016, more than 60 or 80 Syrian troops and possibly some Russian advisors were killed by an airstrike, which the United States said was an error, but which the Russians insisted was closely coordinated with the ISIL fighters, who used the bombing to immediately stage an assault on the base, the Syrian base that was under siege. The Russians went wild over this. You don't know that. You heard some little muffling about it, but let me just tell you that it's described extensively in the book. They delivered an ultimatum to the United States. Again, you never heard the word ultimatum used. It was. And the whole series of measures was set out. The one that you heard about was the Russians cut off all communications with the United States in the regional level, and that therefore all aircraft flying into Syrian airspace were liable to be shot down by Russian anti-aircraft missiles without identification and without discussion. That got people's attention, particularly military. The Belgians, I mean, I live in Brussels, so I follow what the Belgians were doing. They had 2 F-16s down there, and from that day they stopped flying. That was only one of a whole set of measures that was intended to get the attention of the U.S. military. So what happened in September 2016? It was the Secretary of State Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had signed off on a ceasefire agreement to stop hostilities. You may remember that this was when the Russians were leading their assault, their air assault, to liberate Aleppo. And they had an agreement with the United States to halt all of their hostilities, which was, frankly speaking, a decision and action which the Russians didn't like at all, which they agreed to reluctantly because they knew this would stop their successful advance on Aleppo. Within a week of that being signed, and was signed upon the written approval of both Obama and Putin, it was undone by the attack I just mentioned. And the Russians were furious, as Lavrov said with undisguised irritation and irony, that the policy of Obama and of Kerry had become a victim or casualty of collateral damage by the Pentagon boss. The Russians were genuinely afraid that the United States government was out of control. So, to come to just to be sure that that problem did not end with the Obama administration, by his attack on April 7th, 2017, on the Sherat Syrian airbase with those famous tomahawks, Donald Trump once again reopened the Russian fear and anger that things had gotten out of control. As you heard, the United States followed the letter of the agreements they had with Russia over pre-warning about intended military actions. Ostensibly, they gave the Russians 4 hours advance notice of what they're about to do. However, that's not how it played out. The Russians were livid. The Russian military command was claiming that although they had direct Pentagon to Russian Ministry of Defense lines open, they were not used to communicate this. Instead, the Americans used their local forces in Jordan to communicate to the Russians' local forces in Syria. The result is they had minutes, because it was the middle of the night, everybody was asleep, and the word got to the Russians just in time to take some evasive or protective countermeasures. And they were livid. But you didn't hear that in CNN. So this and other key moments in the US-Russian relations have been underreported or simply absent from Western reporting, and they are given due attention in the book, my latest book. Did it have to be this way? I asked that strictly rhetorically. My answer is a resounding no. Going back to 1993, when President Yeltsin visited Warsaw and consented to Poland's accession to NATO, the Kremlin sought and expected to be admitted to NATO itself, and this wish to be integrated into a single security architecture was a constant theme of Russian foreign policy through the Putin era, right up to 2010. Yes, up to 2000. The facts are there. And then it was reluctantly abandoned for a go-it-alone policy, an emphasis on the sovereign state, not entangled by security obligations to others. Is there a way out? Is there a solution? I don't come before you today with a ready, definitive solution. To do so would be to compromise the principle for which I and others have been fighting for the last several years, when all debate and public discussion of our key security risks stopped. It would be to replace one solution arrived at behind closed doors with another arrived at behind closed doors. My first mission, and the mission of my colleagues who are in the room today, is to raise questions, to show that the answers which official Washington has been implementing are poorly conceived. And they're ineffective. And it's not because we are cleverer than they are. It's for a very simple procedural reason. Absence of debate leads to intellectual degradation. You become a dullard in the very literal sense of the word. Debate is not a popular term in the States, and I can tell you it's not a popular term in Europe. People don't like angles anymore, sharp angles. So the best we talk about is round tables. That's not a replacement for debate. Debate should sharpen minds, and we should arrive at good policy. Again, not because one side is smarter than the other, but because it's an inevitable result of intellectual challenge, which is manifestly absent today. So, having issued that warning, I do not shy from offering some tentative recommendations on how to step back from the abyss. I don't promise that we can very quickly reach some kind of cooperation, strategic or otherwise, with Russia. That would be foolish. It's taken us 20 years or more to reach the awful state of confrontation that we have today. However, the Russians are no happier than we should be about this. And if we are to change our overarching concept of what the relationship and what our interaction should be, then we could come to terms very, very quickly. By that I mean that the neoconservative notion about the Soviet Union and détente with the Soviet Union was almost correct, not quite, but almost. That they disparaged the Nixon-Kissinger policy of détente and coexistence, and they said, let's go for it, that we can achieve the overthrow or the disappearance of the Soviet Union. It happened, indeed. But it happened for reasons closer to what George Kennan originally predicted in 1949, by an implosion and by a failure of the Soviet economy and Soviet political system on its own. The fact that Gorbachev reached accommodation with Reagan set the stage, it made feasible the political measures and economic measures that he then pursued and which brought down the Soviet Union. That's not the situation today. Russia is run by very capable economic, financial managers. Russia is run by very capable political statesmen, by people who understand compromise of the divergent and often contradictory interests of different segments of the population, and who know how to rule well, and who have 20 years' experience at it. For us to continue to pursue our policies, which are finally, I believe, the destruction of Russia, is achievable only by collective suicide. And I hope we have enough self-interest and self-awareness to appreciate that and to change our ways. What do I mean by change our ways? To acknowledge that some coexistence with the Russia that exists today is the only way forward. And with that, I'll end this talk.
Thanks. Wow. Where else in Washington will you go to hear an experience not only with academic credentials that won't quit, with commercial credentials that won't quit, and with a journalistic flair that also won't quit. So thanks very much, Gil, for that presentation. I want to make sure that those who came a little bit late know that there's a book review available here. I have 2 copies, which I'll put right on. Sam, maybe you could give to some people who weren't here in the beginning. And I'm familiar with the moderator's prerogative here in Washington to ask the first question. But my first question lasts about 2 minutes or more, and that would be giving you bad example. Okay? And so I'm going to forego that prerogative and ask you to identify yourselves and to then be brief, like asking a question really, not making a speech, and everyone then will get a chance to ask questions that we're all interested in. So first question would go to this gentleman here. Could you identify yourself?
Do we have a microphone?
We do have a microphone, yeah. It probably needs to be turned on. I'm not sure that works. Does that work?
Ralph Winnie with the Eurasia Center. You mentioned the Sochi Olympics and Russia's potential ban from the upcoming Olympics in Korea. Can you tell me exactly what kind of punishment, if any, you think Russia should have received for their alleged involvement in the doping, or is this just some sort of international conspiracy brought on by the U.S.? I really wasn't clear exactly what you thought about that situation.
Yeah. Well, I come right back to where Ray opened this by pointing to how disappointed those detractors of Russia here in the States would have been by Russia's official statements following the announcement of the IOC. The Russians did not go for the bait. Vladimir Putin, I listened to his remarks. His remarks were, first of all, he said we were guilty. I don't think that's been picked up in the press here. He said, yes, we were guilty of things. At the same time, I know that members of our Olympics committee have devoted their whole lives to this event, not just the training of the last 2 or 3 years, but this is the culmination of their ambitions for their whole life, and we will not stand in their way. That's not what the detractors of Russia expected. It was a very statesmanlike approach to a very thorny issue. I can tell you that in Russia there was great disappointment and great anger among the broad population at all of these issues surrounding doping. The single biggest point that comes out of Russian commentary on Russian television, what they say about it, is they resented the application of collective guilt. And that is the finding that I think would be my answer to your question. It's that the whole institution was faulted because of possible violations by some, is what the Russians resent most of all. Then a secondary remark that they make, which also should be aired here, is that why has Russia been singled out as if it is the only violator of doping and other rules of the IOC.
But haven't other countries been singled out for doping, like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan? I know in the sport of weightlifting, there are over 10
Yes.
countries banned.
But that's a
Yeah.
fraction of the countries suspected of doing these things. So Russia has shown remorse,
Okay.
and Russia is hoping that by playing into the ground rules set down in the decision of the IOC, this will be the last Olympics where they face this discrimination. Or discrimination already, it's a too-colored a word, where they face this punishment.
Next question.
Hi, Jim Jatris with myself. You said in Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, this was the beginning in a sense, but that strikes me as that was more the public response from the Russian side that something was terribly wrong. I recall that same year Lavrov said that American policy was reminiscent of the experience of Bolshevism and Trotskyism. Clearly, they were reading something that was coming from our side already by 2007. When do you think the decision on the American side, the real shift from reducing Russia to a client state as it was under Yeltsin was no longer viable, and that some other more breaking Russia's back, as you put it, was the way to go? When do you think that took place inside the American establishment? And if you have any idea who and on what issues they finally decided that break needed to be made?
Well,
Thanks, Jim.
of course, as I've said at the outset, to put Russia in its place and to ensure that it could never revive as a world power was part and parcel of the policy on energy going back to the second. We're talking about the period of Madeleine Albright coming into office. From her entering office, you have the NATO expansion, you have the implementation of various policy objectives that her mentor, who is still her advisor and close colleague, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had written about in his 1997 book, The Great Chessboard. You had Russia was the bad boy in 2003. It was not alone. Russia was not the only power that publicly came out attacking the United States over its planned invasion of Iraq. You had Belgium, you had France, and you had Germany. France got it with freedom fries and pouring French wine into the sewer. The Germans got a much lesser tap on the wrist because they're simply too important to be treated shabbily. But the Russians, well, the Russians were fair game. And so, yes, the Russians singled themselves out for U.S. administration as being vulnerable and being a very good way of kicking ass and showing who's who in the world. Now, still in all, nothing really happened until 2007. Within months of Putin's speech, the United States found its footing and decided they would give Putin one last chance. You may remember there was the open question of inviting him to the ranch for the hot dogs. Well, he wasn't. But they were hoping that the Russians would see the light without our really having to give it to them. I found one wonderful marker, and again, people ask why to use Foreign Affairs magazine, because it is a wonderful marker. They've been very sensitive to these things. In 2000, I said it was February, 3 months later, in an issue, Foreign Affairs magazine, well, they did several things. They published an article called Why Russia Needs to be Contained, written by Yulia Tymoshenko. Okay. Signed by Yulia Tymoshenko. It was, again, anybody doing textual analysis is clear as day that the thinking and the vocabulary are impossible to find among people of her background in Eastern Europe. It's not a unique case. There were many other forged documents, including which CIA encouraged. In the case of this particular document about to mention. It was the German Marshall Fund which did the deeds. That is outsourcing. It wasn't exactly CIA, it was outsourced. They did the deed, they found the authors. In the, when Obama came in and they unveiled the reset program, some Eastern Europeans, Václav Havel and Lech Walesa, signed a letter, an open letter to the president that was published in the New York Times, a critica about how they were being sold down the river by the new administration, and please think about our security. Well, that was a falsified document. So this is nothing new. Again, you don't have. It was my judgment. It was a German intelligence officer very close to all of this who denounced it, and more or less the head of the German Marshall Fund admitted it.
But that's not in the New York Times. How can you say that we would do such a thing?
All right, but just to go back to that famous Yulia Tymoshenko. At the same time, there was question within Foreign Affairs magazine of giving Sergei Lavrov a right of rebuttal. He wrote a right of rebuttal. It was, they cut it by 3/4. Okay, the Russians then issued their own full text version. I did some textual analysis of this. It's all in this book, Stepping Out of Line. As I said, I have a succession of 3 books dealing with these issues. So if you want to dip back in the past, they're also there.
Next question.
Hi, Netra Halpern, Peace Films. You mentioned that there hasn't been any news. There hasn't been any news from a Russian viewpoint, just news about Russia. What is your opinion on the recent FCC's requirement that RT, Russia Today News, register as a foreign agent, even though no other news outlet in the entire country has been required to do that?
I was over at Radio Sputnik yesterday to give an interview, and I was just asking those guys what the mood was. They don't feel so threatened there as their colleagues over at RT. And I have mixed feelings about this issue. I think the Russians have, to a certain extent, blown it out of proportion. And I think so when I say Russians, that isn't quite fair. The responsible person, Simonian, has blown it out of proportion. I have on my app, I have it here, I can demonstrate it because it's on a Wi-Fi. I have on my app, an app on my tablet to receive Russian, Russia 24, Russia Viesti, and so on, live streaming. It works. Even here in Washington, it's not blocked. And if she thought a little bit, instead of beating the drum on how they've been being abused by the Americans, they would drop CNN cable. They would go over to live streaming and podcasts, and we couldn't do a thing about it. And they would have not just the subscribers who shell out money for the cables, but the whole U.S. population without satellites. So I think that she is screaming aloud and foul for reasons that are not substantial. They're propagandistic. And I don't like anybody's propaganda. That the Russians, of course, they're reacting symmetrically. And the Russian Duma has been very, very busy and very fast, unusually fast, to respond symmetrically to the American measures against RT by, well, first Voice of America, but other U.S. channels, including CNN, are going to get hit. And by, I think it was yesterday, the day before yesterday, finding a directly symmetrical response to the exclusion of RT journalists from Congress. Russians are now excluding American journalists from access to the Duma.
Just a word on RT. I'm there frequently whenever they ask me. CNN doesn't ask me anymore. None of the mainstream media ask me anymore. And there's one distinctive thing that I have to concede about RT. They are exceptional in the sense that not once out of the 95 plus times I've been RT have I ever been asked for a pre-interview interview. Okay? BBC, CBS, CNN. Mr. Montgomery, what are you going to say about this? And once BBC said, well, thanks, just the same, but we have somebody else, you know. So there it is, you know. And I would say that a good friend, well, an acquaintance of mine, about 6 or 7 years ago, raised a flag about the danger of RT because she said, as she traveled abroad, she tunes into RT and Al Jazeera, and it's better than U.S. media. Do you know who that was? Not in the New York Times. Yeah, it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. So, I mean, let's not diminish the threat here. To the degree people like me can speak their mind on RT, that's a big, big threat. Ed?
May I just continue that line for 1 second? One thing you're going to find, there are several articles in the new book, which I set out my experiences. Indeed, as Ray said at the beginning, this book is really written as in the first person singular, as a primary source, not as a secondary source. And because I have some experiences that I want to share, and some of them are fairly unique. And the one central issue that's unique is my 9 months of stardom on Russian domestic television. That is Russian television for the Russian audience of millions. And so I've had experience with RT. Occasionally I appear as a self-standing interview or on the crosstalk show of Peter Lavelle. But I've also had more experience in talk shows on the various Russian channels, both private and state, including the television channel of the Russian Armed Forces, Zvezda. So I had a sense of comparison of how these things are run and who is there, who the people are, what their capabilities are. And I had respect particularly for, first, everything that takes place on those talk shows is 100% aired. There is no loss of on the splicing table. Colleagues here in the States who have been more fortunate than Ray and who have been interviewed on Zachariah's program on CNN, they go in for 15 minutes of taping and 90 seconds of the most illogical things they said get on the air. When I went my first appearance on Russian domestic television, the host knew my position was diametrically opposed to his, and I was given every chance to say it.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that this is like, for me, déjà vu, because 40 years ago, a group like this was assembling in one-bedroom apartment in Moscow and criticizing Soviet foreign policy. And then the only thing we could do is we had some contacts with New York Times reporters, and so we would try to pass a message to Washington, please help us. So this was like 40 years ago. So my question is, okay, it's all good, but then what do you do? Because usually, Lenin is famous in Russia. He wrote 2 books, many books, but 2 books. One is who is guilty, and second is what to do. Yeah, so we more or less know who is guilty. But we don't know exactly what we're going to do, because we are now in Washington, we're not in Soviet Union back 40 years ago. So I think we have more freedom, even with all those things you mentioned. So there's something that we can do, and in addition to being scholars, I think we need some activists. So what do you think? Anything that you can suggest that we can do?
We had a pre-meeting yesterday, and as I asked Ed to please not just ask the question, but to answer the question, because he has an answer that you may find useful as we continue this discussion.
Okay, I'll be very brief, but I think the way to do it is, during the Reagan days, we had something like called track 2. When the governments had problems communicating with the public, but I'm not talking just general public, but experts should get into game and come up with some agenda, and I'm pretty sure I can line up top Russian experts in foreign policy military, almost any kind of life. But then the question is about the American side. And we have to find Americans with expertise who can propose some kind of agenda for cooperation. And three names which come to mind immediately because of the recent statements is former Secretary of Defense William Perry, then Senator Sam Nunn, and Secretary of Energy Moniz, I think Ernest Moniz. All of them came up with some strong papers saying that exactly what you mentioned, the threat of this war, nuclear war, is really so alarming that something has to be done. And those are people in a position to talk serious, and their names are recognized. So we need more people like that, and then we can start maybe something what you call track 2, and then push it through media, through social networks, and eventually get to the high places. This is my idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Please.
Thank you. I am Jeff Day, a member of the club and retired from Bloomberg Law, not a special in this, but I am curious at your comment that it was sort of alleged Russian-sponsored interference in elections, not just ours, but others. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, the person who can elaborate in a very direct way to your question is standing right next to you.
Yeah, we veteran intelligence professionals for sanity have done a lot of work on this. Suffice it to say that the notion that $100,000 invested in Facebook, most of it after the election, could have had any effect at all on the election is ludicrous. Really, I mean, when you talk about $1 billion invested by others. So that's one thing. The other thing is,
Identifiable.
yeah, it's not.
Equally identifiable information.
Well, yeah. Are you saying that it's a stretch to identify it with the Russian government?
It is.
It is.
We don't know.
That too.
We don't know if there's
Okay.
a lot more.
The other thing is that after a whole year of using our former technical director of NSA, who's part of our group, saying, look, if the Russians hacked, NSA ipso facto has those emails, has whatever it was that went over the web. And there's nothing, okay? So NSA would have that, and now, as recently as July, we have forensic evidence that the celebrated hack on the 5th of July last year could not have been a hack because of physics, because of fluid dynamics. We know what the internet was capable in terms of speed at that point, and this was copied onto a thumb drive at 2 or 3 times that speed, so it was a local download, and with somebody with direct access to the DNC. So we've done a lot of stuff on that, and it's so countercultural that I've been denounced by some of my former colleagues as a Putin puppet.
What about in Europe?
In Europe, the German intelligence agency warned November of last year, the Russians are going to do it to us. Somebody leaked that to the Süddeutsche Zeitung. 3 months later, it turned out that he had to change his assessment. This was not only the BND, but the BFV, okay? They didn't interfere. Official German government statement. Same with the French. So if you read the New York Times, you wouldn't know any of that. But those things are out there on the web. And so that's the longest short answer to that.
Ray has given you a very direct answer to your question. I will give you an indirect answer based on circumstantial evidence. But since it's evidence that I found myself, it's evidence that I describe in the book. One of the outcomes of my being on these various talk shows in Russia was I met some very important people. On the best shows, you have the heads of Duma, committees. You have their legislators, the Federation Council, the equivalent of their Senate. You have their top journalists, top think tank directors. And These are people with very close access to power, and I think a number of them, particularly the lead journalist, Vladimir Solovyov, who has evenings with Solovyov and Sunday evening with Solovyov. These are widely watched in the country, both live broadcasts across the country and on the internet. And I met with him. I don't mean I had an interview in his office. No, it was before the program started, and we're having coffee or something or a snack. And I went up to him and I asked him, this was 2 weeks before the US election, whom do you want to win? Now, Vladimir Solovyov has interviewed Putin on a feature program, like 1 hour long interview. He's in that circle. He is a little bit more nationalistic than Putin is, closer to Vladimir Zhirinovsky. But he's in that circle. And he told me without batting an eyelash, they don't want Trump to win. And if I list the reasons that he gave me, they're exactly the same reasons that we use here against Trump today. He's volatile, he's dangerous, he's unpredictable, and even if he means it, he'll never be able to do it. They were right.
What about the various things that...
Could you say that again?
Okay, going back, well, in my experience, you have, I guess, beginning, I don't know when it began, but you have administrations, presidents, secretaries of state saying, the reset, Trump's efforts, apparent efforts to relax U.S. sanctions or end them, and have good relations with Russia. Those seem to go nowhere. What, is that just posturing? What is that?
Well, the mood of Congress, they imposed, as you know, they changed the nature of the sanctions from presidential order to U.S. legislation.
And what was the vote?
Oh, I think, what was it, so 5
98
people?
to 2.
That's
Reminiscent of the Supreme Soviet.
But earlier administrations also.
I'm sorry, what about them?
About George W. Bush, the Hillary Clinton's reset, and there may be some before that.
All right, well, Hillary Clinton's reset, I can answer about that. This was not reinstating détente of Nixon, nothing of the sort. Again, if you take a look at my earlier book, particularly going back to Stepping Out of Line in the 2012 book, I describe in detail what happened in the summer of 2008. That is during the electoral campaign, when these heavy people, some of whom were mentioned by Ray, including Kissinger, and leading figures from the Reagan administration, came together to put together a working paper called A New Direction for U.S. Foreign Policy on Russia. And that became the basis for the reset. The reset was not invented by Michael McFaul. It's complete self-serving rubbish that he distributed. The whole program of reset was prepared before the election to be used by whoever won. And it had these big names, and it was taken to the Kremlin. Kissinger was one of the people who came to deliver it. So the reset was not a rebirth, a renaissance of Kissinger-Nixon détente. It had very limited objectives, and the limited objectives were renewal of the SALT agreement, which was expiring and which we seemed in no way ready to do, to the great alarm of those who had worked for decades on disarmament.
Yeah, thanks, Gil. Another inflection point, if I can use that academic expression, of course, was the coup, the Western initiated coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February 2014. The U.S. had done some sanctions, economic sanctions against Russia before the coup. But after the coup and after the shoot down of MH17, the Europeans were finally brought into line behind more sanctions from all, okay? And so the Europeans suffered from that. Some of them have recovered, especially Russia. But it was the coup in Kiev, described by George Friedman, head of Stratfor, as the most blatant coup in the history of mankind. Why? Because it was advertised 2 weeks ahead on YouTube. Intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and our ambassador in Kiev. I mean, it's right there. We were planning who would take over. So that was a major inflection point. And the New York Times and the rest of the media, of course, say, well, history began on the 23rd of February, 2014, when Putin came back from Sochi, where he was totally preoccupied with the Olympics, and said, my God, what are we going to do? It looks like they're going to try to get Ukraine into NATO. First thing we have to do is figure out what we do about Crimea. We can't possibly even think about losing our only warm-water port in the world, okay? And that's where, that's where this stuff sort of evolved. And it was, that was an inflection point to negate the big inflection point in September of 2013, 8 months before, when Putin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and said, look, I am delighted at the new atmosphere of trust, is the word he used, between the President of the United States and me. That was when he bailed Obama out by getting Syria to destroy all its chemical weapons. It looked like a new horizon. Well, it only took the neocons, October, November, December, January, for 6 months to put that in, put the kibosh on that by arranging this coup in Kiev, which is never given adequate attention. But you want to talk about an inflection point? That's a big one.
Well, just to,
yes,
just
please.
To continue that, sorry, Ray, for 1 second. Just to continue that point, by training, I'm an historian. And as I've come to appreciate over many years, the decisive element in interpreting current events or in interpreting any historical development is the starting date. Do you start on February 22nd or on February 23rd? Do you start the history of the Baltic states with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or do you start in the 17th century when these states became part of the Russian Empire by dynastic marriages and so forth? You have a very different perspective on what we're talking about. And that is why one of the virtues of my writing is to try to keep the record straight. What happened first, what happened next, who did what to whom when.
Please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jafar Jafari. I'm with
Can I hear your name?
Jafar Jafari with Al Mayadeen TV network. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Syria, since you mentioned it several times. The status of the United States forces in Syria in particular has been deliberately vague, and for understandable reasons. When Mr. Obama said that defeating ISIS is going to take 30 years, that was understandable why they would look into the far distance. Now, recently, the Pentagon, as well as the State Department, were saying that as soon as ISIS is defeated, the United States will look into withdrawing. No longer that is the case. However, ISIS has been defeated for all intents and purposes. So what is the U.S. trying to do in Syria, since it already has 12 military bases in northern Syria?
Thank you.
Well, you said the situation with respect to the U.S. forces in Syria is vague, only here in the United States. Outside the United States, it's crystal clear. It's illegal. It's against international law. It's not, they have no invitation from the Syrian government, whom we otherwise recognize, and is otherwise a member of the United Nations. Therefore, it is illegal. Now, when are we going to leave? I think pretty soon. And I think what's doing us in on that is the Russian agreement with the Kurds. the cover for the U.S. presence has been to protect the Kurdish enclave. Well, the Kurds are reaching their accommodation with the Russians because they see who's going to be around and who isn't going to be around. So as soon as that deal is done and the political settlement moves on, I think the United States will be very vigorously disinvited from Syria and will have no reason to be there, because the people it's supposed to protect will be working with the Russians.
Mm-hmm. If I could just add a little wrinkle to that from an intelligence officer perspective, Trump may say, okay, we're not there anymore, but the deep state is going to be there. They are there. They're there in thousands. They're the people that John Brennan and the CIA and others and the Israelis enlisted to disrupt things. And there is no way that anyone can understand U.S. policy toward that area of the world, and specifically Syria, without realizing the inordinate influence that the Israel lobby has on our policymakers. Witness what just happened with Jerusalem. So, you ask what's going on in Syria? What's going on in Syria is U.S. is doing what it thinks to be not only in its own interest, but mostly, and I say mostly advisedly, in Israel's interest. So we're not going to leave. And, we're not going to leave in a subterranean way. Trump may even say we're completely out of there. But Trump doesn't call the shots when it comes to what John Brennan has created. Sam, did you want to answer?
Sam Husseini, Institute for Public Accuracy. I'd like to take you up more, Gilbert, on your admonition for debate. So I'd like to, say something about part of your argument in terms of how tense things are between the Soviet Union, and sort of building on what Ray just said. What happened last week was Flynn admitted to lying to the FBI. The first lie was about not so much Russia, about Israel, even though Israel wasn't mentioned in the plea agreement. The incoming Trump administration was strong-arming members of the UN Security Council to delay a vote condemning Israeli sanctions. So the Russians apparently did try to delay that agreement. The Egyptians withdrew their support of that pending resolution after Trump called the Sisi of Egypt. And I just found out this week, Russia in April made a statement saying that that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. They didn't move their embassy. It had a lot of pro-Palestinian rhetoric in it, but they still put that out there, fairly clearly at the behest of the Trump administration. So, one senses that there's a very different sort of so-called great power divvying up that has nothing to do with the standard media mantra about collusion that's going on. And so I think that we do need to be aware of that, both in terms of how that could affect other countries, and also to what extent there's an actual threat of direct confrontation, and to what extent this is just elbowing for supremacy in different realms.
Well, just to expect complete consistency in foreign policy of any country, given all of the complexities and all of the other things in play, I think is very ambitious and overly optimistic. At the same time, to use the contradictions that you have just underlined and to argue that there is no consistency and no general policy line by the Russian government, I think would be also a big mistake. You are, from our discussion, brief discussion, I think you are implying that there is more optimistic, more reason for optimism about our relations because things that we don't know about suggest that we are more careful about stepping on one another's toes. What's missing here is the real dimension that sets off the alarm bells. And that is, the real dimension is not the likelihood of an intentional war. It is the likelihood, the very high possibility of an unintentional war. Because the level of trust is so low, suspicion is so high, we are operating in close proximity in volatile areas where proxies can cause misunderstanding of intentions. That we could have a confrontation that is not intended by the policymakers, neither the Kremlin or Washington, but that draws us into a war.
Other wars have started that way, I think. You know more history than I do. Let's say two administrative announcements here. When I'm teaching, I always have to say, after an hour and a half, that you are free to go. We're not finished. You're free to stay as well, and I am advised that we have there's nobody else in this room for a long time. So those of you who can stay, I anticipate even more interesting questions. So let's leave it at that. And now, one thing I'd just comment on, we talked about Ed's suggestion of a track two approach where they're real experts. In Gil's preface, I think it is, he talks about the kitchen cabinet that Trump has. Well, I mean, I'm forced to comment that there are no cooks in that kitchen with any professional training, except those who've studied at the CIA. I mean, of course, the Culinary Institute of America. I mean, and that's not the best of cook things. So this is a real problem. Experienced Russian experts, not needed. Not needed here, not needed in Europe. When Germany created a group to look into what to do about the Russian threat, they had trouble finding, as Gil has pointed out, they had trouble finding a Russian or a Russian expert, a German Russian expert, who knew anything about Russia. So you're free to stay. You're also free to go. Here's the next question.
Yes, I was curious about your book, your new book. I'm glad interested in reading.
Your name, sir?
Oh, sorry, Robert Keith. I'm from Brooklyn. I'm just here as an individual. Your book, which says worried about the failure of the United States. Quite independently, I have been playing with this idea of Venezuela being a cautionary tale for the United States. Back in '99, when Chavez took over, his group took over from the 1%. Mm-hmm. That's basically what happened. By the way, I lived in Venezuela 10 years, and I worked in Latin America for 20, so I have a fairly good familiarity. So the question then is the situation now with the fellow who's there. He's not going anywhere. Trump thinks, well, we want to remove this dictator. You know, it's a terrible thing, this dictator in Latin America. This is the man who's going to be in Venezuela. He has a majority by a huge amount. He's their representative. He's not going anywhere. He's going to be there. So,
your question?
Oh, okay, sorry. I just want to hear more about your failure, the idea of how the United States is going to fail.
Well, it's very disappointing that Donald Trump, who on the campaign trail presented himself as a realist, looking after national interests, and not pursuing demons abroad, not trying to change regimes, has, in the very issue you're mentioning, adopted precisely that other approach of doing away with dictators. Of course, the list of American dictators changes, I wouldn't say daily, but certainly monthly. And Erdogan was either a nice chap or an authoritarian, or once again a nice chap, or once again an authoritarian, according to whether he hoed the line from Washington on this or another issue. It is very unfortunate that this line of reasoning of saving countries from their dictators has been taken up by Donald as ducks take to water. And it's very sad because it's totally inconsistent with the other side of Donald, who says that we're going to be in the Reagan sense, the shining example to the world, the beacon on the hill, and we're not going to impose our ways on anybody else.
Next question goes to Professor Kuznick.
Peter Kuznick, American University. Gil, would you talk about the truth or not truth of Russian relations with right-wing forces in Eastern Europe and in France and Germany and other places? And to what extent is that actually going on? What is behind it? And what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, let's place the Russian government politically. Although there are a number of countries around the world that have very fond recollections of Russia as the great power behind leftist ideas, the Russian government today is a center-right government, pursuing, for the first half of Putin's time in presidency, neoliberal economics. The Kudrin, who was his finance minister for what must have been 8 years, and who was voted several times the best finance minister in Europe, was a neoliberal. So the fact that Russia might tilt towards right parties as opposed to left parties has to be understood, first of all, in that context. But you're not talking about right parties, you're talking about radical right parties. There, I don't have superior information to what you otherwise would find in the media. I am perplexed, but not worrying too much about levels of Russian support, say, to Marine Le Pen and those loans that were made to her, well, not a great deal of money, that were made to her party, and which received a lot of attention. I do pay attention to something else that's usually pulled out by people who are making the argument that you just made, and that is, I think it goes back a year and a half, there was a meeting of far-right party representatives in St. Petersburg. And that's often brought out as a kind of proof. You see, we told you so. In that particular case, and because it's brought out so often, I know for a fact that that was a private initiative of these parties and it had no official sponsorship or recognition by the Russian government. The fact that Mr. Orban in Hungary has a deep appreciation of the economic benefits of a good relationship with Russia and is pursuing the national interests of his country, and the fact that that same Mr. Orban is denounced from the EU headquarters for his anti-democratic, so that as I describe it, measures, well, that is a coincidence, but it is not a result of the Russians are befriending Mr. Orban because he's the man in power in Hungary, which has been traditionally an important customer for Russian nuclear technology and other. The very same time, another anti-democratic government in the EU that is denounced from Belgium is the Kaczynski's regime in Warsaw. And you can't think of a country that is more hostile to Russia in all international affairs than Poland is under the Kaczynskis. So again, to look for consistency or to assume that because countries are, causes are aligned, there is something deep going on, I think is an error. I'm not aware of any particular Russian sympathy. Then again, let's look at another area. Since Putin is often described as an authoritarian or a dictator or admirer of Stalin, there is no person in political power in Russia today who is more vigorously anti-Stalinist, anti-dictatorial than Mr. Putin is. But you're not going to find that on CNN. It's not in their interest to give much coverage to the meeting that he had with the Memorial people and other members of this forum of civil society, in which he met with people who were severe critics, who were, I think of Madame Alexeyeva, who was a dinosaur, a Sakharov era fighter for civil liberties in Russia, who 3 years ago, I heard in Brussels, under the patronage of Bill Browder, denouncing the Russian regime as reminiscent of 1937 and the Great Terror. Madame Alexeyeva has been tamed by Vladimir Putin. And she appeared in very civil discourse with him, not as a fan, of course, but as a talking partner, with facing similar interests and end objectives. If he can have such company, then I dismiss entirely the notion that this man is an intellectual partner or supporter of the alt-right.
Thank you, Gil. Any other questions? Netra?
I'd like to know, Ray, what you think about Ed's suggestion of Russian experts for track 2 diplomacy, and whether you think you might be a candidate for that.
Well, I stand ready. My hope is that something is going on under the veil here. I know that arms control people are in touch, the Arms Control Association. So it may be a forlorn hope, but I do hope that track 2 things are happening. But Ed is directly right. We need experts to be involved, and of course I would be happy to be enlisted in that. If I could make an inflection here out of my own personal experience, I was chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch in the early 70s at CIA. I had 3 people in my branch working with the SALT delegation, rotating. One with the delegation, one reporting at CIA headquarters, and one supporting the military analysis people, okay? One of those was a fellow named Bobby Gates. You may recognize his name. He was Secretary of Defense after a while, okay? Now, because of our work, we could say to Nixon, not Reagan, to Nixon, if you trust, we can verify, okay? You say, really? Yeah. And so for the first time in the history of our strategic relationship, we introduced a period of stability in the strategic equation because of the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. I had the privilege of being there in Moscow when that treaty was signed. So fast forward to 2001, and here is George Bush saying, well, we don't need that treaty, you know. That was the benchmark, the cornerstone of strategic stability. Now we have ABM forces encircling Russia, not only in Europe, but in Asia as well. And, you know, my friend Ambassador Jack Matlock, who was instrumental in getting me to Moscow in '72, made a terrible diplomatic mistake at Valdai 2 years ago. When Putin asked him, why are you building these anti-ballistic missile systems now that Iran is not a threat? He said, well, Mr. Putin, you have to acknowledge that really the ABM systems development is basically a jobs program. A jobs program, okay? Now, Putin, of course, chuckled and pursued him on that. But Putin does not have the option of sitting around with his generals who see that their ICBM force is going to be threatened within 2 years because of cruise missiles put in these same holes as the ABM thing in Central Europe and Poland, Romania, and the Black Sea. He can't say, don't worry, generals. It's really just a job program. It'll never work. That's not why military intelligence works. You judge capabilities, not intentions, and you have to deal with it. So what I want to stress here, in combining what I just said with what happened in Kiev. Now, not many people know that when the Russians initiated or blessed the plebiscite, the referendum in Crimea, where they voted to rejoin Russia, the next day, Putin was on one of these 4-hour, incredible 4-hour marathon Q&A with people from all over Russia, okay? And at one point, and this is April 17, 2014, he says, look, you know, the missile defense issue, this is a quote, the missile defense issue is no less and probably even more important than NATO's eastward expansion. Incidentally, our decision on Crimea was partially prompted by this. Well, they didn't want Ukraine, like Poland and Romania, and the Black Sea to be infested with these so-called ABM systems, which in a couple of years, as Putin has acknowledged and has said that the Pentagon knows that we know this, will be susceptible, will be able to take out their ICBM force. So, when I see that, I have sort of a personal thing, because nobody seemed to give a rat's patootie about leaving the ABM treaty, but that was big. That was incredibly big.
You used to call jobs for boys.
What's that?
Jobs for boys. You said jobs program. It used to call jobs for boys.
Jobs for
Boys.
for boys.
Jobs for boys.
B-O-Y-S?
Right. B-O-Y-S. Well, I know this is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate your patience here, and I want to ask you to tell me, really, would you permit me to ask my 2-minute question now? You would? Okay, good. I have it written down here so that I won't go on forever. We Irish tend to go on forever, as you may have noticed. This has to do with kind of broadening out the whole spectrum and trying to figure out what makes us exceptional. And I go back to right after the war. For me, that's World War II, okay? I was alive during that whole war, okay? And right after the war, who became chief of the Policy Planning Council of the State Department but my former idol, George Kennan, okay? And what was the first paper that he wrote? Well, I'll only quote a little bit of it, but you'll get the drift. Quote, "We have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of the world's population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. Now, to do that, we have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we will have to deal in straight power concepts." Okay, George Kennan, 1948, actually, the year before, okay? Now, do we still think that today? Well, here's Donald Trump in China last month, okay? Nobody, well, I haven't seen this cited, but here Trump is trying to ingratiate himself with these other people. He says, "I can understand how one country can take advantage of another country for the benefit of its people. I really applaud that." So, now there was a high point, an inflection of high point, which I mentioned before. It occurred on the September 11th, 2013, when Mr. Putin was allowed to write an op-ed in the New York Times. I am reliably informed that the last paragraph of this op-ed, which was in the afterglow of Putin having pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire by getting the Syrians to have their chemical weapons destroyed on U.S. naval ships outfitted for such destruction. And here's Putin, the last paragraph, which again, I'm told he wrote himself. Quote, "My working and personal relationship with President Obama is marked by growing trust. And I would rather disagree, though, with a case he made on American exceptionalism. It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional. There are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions and those still finding their way to democracy. Their policies differ, too. We're all different. But when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created all of us equal." I think I've heard that before. All men and women are created, so it has a familiar ring anyway. So my question really, Gil, and thanks for all your good work, and thanks for being so courageous, and thanks for coming here on your own hook. I mean, your publisher didn't fund this, did he? Who's your publisher? You. Okay. So what I want to ask you is this, U.S. exceptionalism. You know the political situation here as well as you know the political situation in Russia. I would ask your prognosis. Will the U.S. be able to get beyond George Kennan, Madeleine Albright, Donald Trump, and join the rest of the world as an equal partner, not only vis-a-vis Russia, but vis-a-vis China? Do you think that that's in the cards? And if so, what's necessary to make that happen?
Well, I think the question of a time frame is decisive in this. It is improbable that that type of change in mentality here in this country could happen quickly. It could happen quickly only with some awful disaster, which would be a disaster that befalls not just the United States, but the world at large. The fate of this country is inseparable from the fate of the world at large because of our large footprint, because of our economic prominence and importance. So nobody in his right mind would wish for the United States to have a setback of proportion to change mentalities such as you're describing. But over time, I think it is achievable, and it will come from many small steps. And that was my call today, to step back from the abyss and step back from, in the case of George Kennan, it was a man who was, as his official biographer described, quite cynical, quite elitist, unashamedly so, reflecting his class background or the class culture that he imbibed as a child and as a student and as a university student and as he made his career. So he said some things which are quite embarrassing for a modern reader about the people. But underlying that was a dedication to national interests and security interests. And that issue is still in play today, and we are not, if you look at American universities, it's still on the curriculum. The Chicago School, which gave the formulation to American political realism, is still upholding that tradition in the person of John Mearsheimer, for example. So it's not a lost cause, but that has to be dusted off and receive a wider acceptance. Unfortunately, Donald, by his many contradictions, has given that approach a bad name. But it's not just the question of exceptionalism that needs to be overturned. It is part and parcel of political correctness. It is, it's one of the commandments in the present majority political correctness, and again, which did not start yesterday, has received very heavy development on the left of center, going back to the Clinton years, and has maintained its position today in the fight against Donald Trump.
One follow-up question here. Why don't you say these things to the students at GW, for example, or at Columbia, where you have a PhD in this kind of thing, or at Harvard, where you were a magna cum laude graduate from the college? Why don't you say that there?
Well, I don't want to be too dismissive about Harvard in particular, having been present at the commencement proceedings there at the end of May, when the outgoing, which she announced at the time that she's outgoing after 10-year tenure, president of Harvard University, Drew Faust, made a courageous and very remarkable speech in defense of free speech on campus, and made, among other remarks, the statement to the gathered audience in the yard, the Harvard yard, the remarks that I wouldn't want our university to be a bubble that is separated from, isolated from the rest of the world. It was our being cut off from news sources, from information sources, that we find distasteful, that we were blindsided by the rise and vote into office of Donald Trump. I support entirely that her remarks favoring free speech on campus. At the same time, I sadly tell you that there is no free speech as regards Russian matters, at least, on Harvard campus. My colleagues who have tried repeatedly over the last several years to be invited to or to organize roundtable discussions at the Belfer Center, which is, or the other Russia and International Affairs centers on the Harvard campus or on the Kennedy School campus, have been strung along and ultimately kicked away by people who are very well known, and I will not name them to shame them. At Columbia, the Harriman Institute, which is the Center for Russian Studies, these are the two, to mention this, which I happen to be alumni of both institutions, but they are, the fact remains, quite apart from me and any personal preferences, the two founding centers of Russian studies in this country, going back to 1949, with Ford Foundation grants and State Department grants. They are both closed to anything except for the Washington narrative. And that is a dumbing down, a dumbing down. When the Harriman Institute, I clashed with the now head of the Harriman Institute, Cooley, Professor Cooley, when a year and a half ago he introduced and had a book presentation by Bill Browder, a book entitled Why Europe Needs the Magnitsky Act. And I had seen Bill Browder 3 months earlier presenting that book with the editor of that book at the Press Club of Brussels. And I received, as all other participants at that event, a free copy of it. And I looked at it. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was no ISDN number. It was not a published book. It was a printed book with Browder's money. And then Cooley cheekily told me it was a major book of our times. Can you deal with those people? I'm not welcome there. It's not for lack of trying. I don't want to bemoan any personal insults, because they're not personal insults. They're insults to free thinking and to intelligence. And the losers in that are these institutions, which are no longer institutions of higher learning. They're kindergartens.
Did you see that film, by the way? The film on Magnitsky?
I didn't just see that film. I was the presenter of that film with Andrei Nekrasov to the Brussels Press Club, and I took tremendous pride in the irony of presenting Nekrasov and his film in the very room where Browder had shamefully presented his pack of lies.
I think the overall problem is that American people are not able to look at America from outside. They only look at it from the inside. So that's very important. But I'll tell you another thing. The only way, I'm not very hopeful, because the only way that happens is when you're actually outside. It's not going to happen inside.
Well, it used to be able to find, you used to be able to, now this betrays my age, okay? It used to be able to be possible to learn what's going on in the world from reading the New York Times. I grew up in the Bronx. My parents read the New York Times page, the whole thing, every day, and if they didn't finish, they fell asleep, they put it in a special place, and they wouldn't touch the next day's Times until they finished reading it, okay? Now in those days, most of the stuff they could print, okay? Nowadays, it's, well, what I always tell my college students is this, that I've seen a lot of change in this country in the last 55 years, okay? You hang around 55 years of Washington, that's what you see, but there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes in significance, and that is that we no longer have, in any real sense, a free media. That is big. If we didn't have the internet coming down, I couldn't figure out what was going on. So that's the fifth estate, and that gives me hope. But people have to realize, and as recently as just 2 days ago, I talked to a dean guy who's been around here forever, you know, and he didn't know anything about Russiagate that we have revealed in our alternative media, and he should have, because he was asking me questions about it.
Isn't that just a retired journalist who likes history, likes history.
Business? Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
not Bloomberg Business, but Bloomberg Law.
Okay.
The history of journalism, sort of popular, shall we say, mainstream's the wrong word, but prior to FDR, and really prior to World War II and its aftermath, the press was very sort of partisan. It's a bit like it is today, very, if you will, tribal. And it's really only, all kinds of remarkable things happened after World War II. I think because of that experience, coming out of the Depression, and the U.S. standing economically astride the world, that combination of things made for a pretty interesting 50 years. But the press, historically, going back to the beginning of the Republic, was very different than it was in that era.
I'll just add that after 9/11, finish your sentence for me. You know it, after 9/11, everything, oh, come on, you guys. After 9/11, everything changed, right? Okay, so instead of tribal, we have one tribe, okay? That's my comment on that. We have the one tribe. Do you want to comment on that, Gilbert?
Well, the issue is, of course, much wider than that. Going back to 1985, Noam Chomsky's co-authored book on the press, what was it? Manufacturing Consent?
Manufacturing dissent.
Consent.
Consent. Yes. He dealt with that extensively. The main point that he was making is that U.S. press eats out of the hand of the State Department releases, or that we have no censorship, we have self-censorship, because you know what your audience can accept and will deal with, and you know what they cannot deal with. However, what's going on now, I think, is much wider than this issue. It's really the tragedy of journalism, particularly print journalism. It is the economics of journalism today. Journalists in fields far apart have a hard time making a living. Let's take culture, for example, music, for example. I can tell you in Belgium, there was a meeting this week by the Presse Musicale, the Musical Journalists Association, which is ready to dissolve because none of them, the people who've been printing in the major newspapers of Belgium for the last 30 years, none of them can place their reviews in their home newspapers anymore. It's a disaster. So let's be a little bit easy on people. It's really an industry-wide problem that has also this political dimension.
Okay, one more maybe? And then you're all welcome to hang around and talk to Gil at whatever length you wish. As I say, we have this room for a long time.
Oh, one more question. Are you going to give away your book? Which probably, I guess, does have an ISBN number.
Oh, it definitely does have an ISBN. No, I don't have copies to give away. And frankly speaking, I'll be honest about it, I don't believe in that principle. People who receive the book for free almost never read it. Thank you.
Okay, I moved here to DC about a year ago, and what I'm seeing is that the precepts that Kennan put out are still alive and well, but there's this whole overlay of how great and nice we are. There's hundreds, or even, I don't know, many hundreds of NGOs in this town that are all about human rights and democracy, and yet almost none of them are willing to challenge the war machine, the military-industrial complex that is creating all these wars, that are creating all these human rights problems and refugee problems the worldwide. So it's become sneakier than what Kennan did. Now it's like underlaid and propaganda.
You're right, and this goes to self-censorship. And I have a little vignette that I'll pass along, personal one. In 2006, it was May 4th, I was in Atlanta at the same time that Donald Rumsfeld was there. If you go to YouTube, McGovern, Rumsfeld, you'll see it, okay? I had a chance to ask him real questions like, why did you lie about weapons of mass destruction? Why did you lie about ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda? It was the only thing that happened in the whole world that day, and it was at 12 o'clock noon, so the C-SPAN and CNN, who were doing it live, they had a lot of competition that night. I was on virtually all the things. Now, the first thing I got was a telephone call on my cell phone as I'm leaving this assembly where I was sort of persona non grata. Mr. McGovern, yes, this is Anderson Cooper. Oh, hi, Anderson. Well, you're causing quite a stir down here in Atlanta. I'd like to have you on my program, but I need to ask you a question first. Sure. Weren't you, well, how do I say that? Weren't you afraid? Now, I was still in some shell shock there from having done what I did. And I said, that's a normal question. I said, well, no, I have briefed defense ministers, defense secretaries before. So I went, and then I said, wait a second. Anderson Cooper, heir to the Vanderbilt fortune, pretty face on CNN. He's never going to be out in the streets of Atlanta with his hat, you know. So I said, McGovern, this is your chance. So I said, Anderson, let me be really candid with you. It was a real high. I had done my homework. I knew that if I asked him questions, he would have to lie, and he did. You know, it was, actually, I'm really glad. It was a real high. Anderson, you might want to try that sometime. Do your research. Ask him some real questions. And I said, whoa, that's very, very good. I'll have my people get in touch with your people. No, Anderson, no. I don't have any people. Just call me back here. So it was on, right? And then it was on with Paula Zahn on CBS. First thing she says is, so, Mr. McGovern, how long have you had this animus toward the Secretary of Defense?